Somewhere in the archives of the old Luftwaffe interrogation center at Oberursel, outside Frankfurt, there are still files with a small, precise stamp on them. Dulag Luft. It stood for Durchgangslager der Luftwaffe, the transit camp for captured airmen, and it was where every Allied flyer shot down over occupied Europe eventually passed through on his way to a permanent prisoner of war camp. Before that happened, German intelligence officers sat these men down and extracted whatever they could. Squadron, aircraft type, target, crew position, nationality. That last detail is the one this story turns on, because it means something most people never think about when they picture a night fighter pilot climbing into the dark to hunt bombers over Germany. In the air at 14,000 feet, in the pitch black of a European winter night, a German pilot closing in beneath a four-engined bomber could not see a flag, a badge, or an accent. He could see a silhouette and a set of engine exhausts. He had no idea, in the moment his cannon fired, whether the men above him were English, Canadian, Australian, or, in a very particular and recurring case, from a country most of them had never given a second thought to before the war. New Zealand! But afterward, on the ground, in the wreckage, in the interrogation rooms, and in the paperwork that both sides kept with obsessive precision, that anonymity disappeared. And it is in that paperwork, cross-referenced decades later against squadron loss records on the other side of the world, that a very specific and very strange record survives. A record of one small country's air crews, and what the men who hunted them in the dark eventually learned and sometimes wrote down about who they had actually been fighting. So here is the question worth sitting with before we go any further. Why does it matter what a handful of German night fighter pilots, decorated killers with dozens of confirmed kills between them, thought about the crews of one small squadron from the far side of the world? The answer is that it doesn't, not to the war's outcome, not to the strategic calculus of the bombing campaign. It matters for a smaller, harder reason. Because for the young men flying in those bombers, night after night, the only audience that ever really saw what they did in the final seconds of their lives was the enemy hunting them. And in a strange number of cases, that enemy wrote it down. Before we go further into what they recorded, if you're finding this kind of history interesting, this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell, so hit subscribe now before you get pulled into the rest of it, because it only gets stranger from here. To understand what the Germans were actually recording, you first have to understand what they were up against, because the night sky over Germany by 1943 had become one of the strangest and most lethal battlefields of the entire war. And almost none of it looked anything like the daylight dogfights people picture when they think of the air war. New Zealand's contribution to that fight was built primarily around one unit, 75 Squadron of the Royal Air Force, universally known as 75 New Zealand Squadron, the first Commonwealth squadron of its kind formed in the entire war. It began in 1940 with a handful of Wellington bombers that New Zealand air crews had originally flown to Britain simply to deliver, only to find themselves and their aircraft absorbed directly into Bomber Command when the war broke out before they could sail home. From those first Wellingtons, the squadron grew through the war into a Sterling and eventually Lancaster-equipped unit, flying missions deep into occupied Europe and Germany itself, night after night, for the better part of 5 years. But 75 Squadron was only the visible core of a much larger contribution. Thousands more New Zealanders served scattered through dozens of other RAF squadrons across Bomber Command, so that by the time the war ended, the country had sent a proportion of its young men into the night skies over Germany that, relative to its tiny population, was almost unmatched by any other Allied nation. Almost none of these men had trained for what was actually waiting for them. Let's be honest about how strange this fight was, because on paper it makes very little sense. A four-engined bomber, a Lancaster or a Sterling, carried a crew of 7, armed with nothing heavier than rifle-caliber machine guns in isolated turrets, operating at night over enemy territory, guided only by dead reckoning, basic radio aids, and the stars when the cloud allowed it. Against them, by the middle years of the war, Germany had built one of the most sophisticated defensive systems ever assembled. A chain of ground radar stations feeding data to twin-engined night fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-110S and Junkers Ju-88S, themselves carrying airborne radar sets capable of picking a single bomber out of the dark from over a mile away. The bomber crew's only real defense was darkness itself, and darkness, by 1943, was rapidly becoming an illusion. The men flying those night fighters were, without much exaggeration, among the most effective air combat specialists the war produced on either side. Helmut Lent, flying for Nachtjagdgeschwader 1, became the first pilot in history to claim 100 night victories, a career total that would eventually reach 110 confirmed kills before his death in a landing accident in October 1944. Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, flying almost exclusively the Messerschmitt Bf-110, would finish the war as the single most successful night fighter pilot who ever lived, with 121 confirmed victories credited to his name, earned in barely over 160 combat sorties. These were not lucky men stumbling onto targets. They were the product of a system built with terrifying precision to find bombers in the dark and kill them before the crew inside ever knew they were being hunted. And in late 1943, that system got a new weapon that changed everything, and changed it specifically for crews flying exactly the kind of aircraft New Zealanders were flying in the greatest numbers. It was called Schräge Musik, slanted music, a name almost cheerfully mismatched to what it actually did. German engineers had noticed something that should have been obvious from the very design of British heavy bombers, but somehow had gone unaddressed for years. Neither the Lancaster nor the Sterling carried any gun turret covering the space directly beneath the aircraft. None. A night fighter that could sneak in underneath a bomber, matching its speed in the darkness, was flying in a blind spot. The crew above had no way to defend, no way to even see into. German technicians solved that gap with a pair of cannon mounted to fire almost straight upward, angled forward at roughly 70 degrees, allowing a night fighter to slide in beneath an unsuspecting bomber, climb slowly into position without ever entering the arc of any defensive gun, and fire directly into the wing route and fuel tanks from less than 200 meters away. The results in the winter of 1943 and into 1944 were close to catastrophic for Bomber Command. And here is the detail that made it so devastating for so long. Crews very often had no idea what had actually killed the aircraft flying beside them. Witnesses in the bomber stream describe watching a neighboring aircraft simply explode without warning. No tracer, no visible attacker, nothing but a sudden ball of fire where a Lancaster or Sterling had been flying seconds before. Many crews assumed it was extraordinarily accurate flak. It was not flak. It was a night fighter they had never seen, closing from directly below, in a position their own aircraft had never been designed to defend. This is where 75 New Zealand Squadron's own operational records intersect directly with the story this video is about. Because those records still exist, and they are precise, almost to the point of being unbearable to read. Across the war, the squadron lost 75 Wellingtons alone on operations, and when researchers decades later broke those losses down by cause, the pattern tells its own story about how the danger shifted as the war went on. Flak claimed the largest single share. Night fighters claimed a close second, and a further significant number were simply lost without trace. Aircraft that took off into the dark toward Germany and never returned. With no crash site, no crew, and no explanation ever recovered on the British side of the war at all. But some of those explanations do exist. They exist on the other side. Picture the scene from inside a German night fighter cockpit, because it is worth sitting with for a moment before we go further. A pilot and his radar operator, alone in a cramped, dark aircraft, guided first by a ground controller reading British aircraft on radar from a station somewhere below, then handed off to their own onboard set as they close the final distance. The radar operator calls range and bearing in a low, controlled voice. The pilot, straining to see anything at all in the black, finally makes out a shape against the stars, a long, dark silhouette with 4 engine exhausts glowing faintly. He does not know, and cannot know, whether the men flying it are English farm boys from Yorkshire, Canadians from Saskatchewan, or, as it very often was, New Zealanders who had crossed an entire ocean and half the globe to be sitting in that particular cockpit on that particular night. He simply closes the range, positions his aircraft beneath the target, and fires. What happened after that moment is where this story genuinely becomes something different from every other account of the bombing campaign. Because in a meaningful number of cases, the German side did not stop paying attention once the bomber went down. Every confirmed kill required a formal claim, an Abschussmeldung, cross-checked where possible against crash site details, wreckage, and, whenever there were survivors, the interrogation that followed at Dulag Luft. It is in exactly this paperwork, matched patiently after the war by researchers on both sides, working from German unit records and New Zealand squadron histories, that specific New Zealand crews reappear, not as anonymous statistics, but as named men, whose final flight can be reconstructed almost minute by minute from 2 completely different sets of wartime records that were never meant to speak to each other. One of the clearest of these belongs to a Sterling, captained by a young New Zealand pilot named Doug Henley, flying with 75 Squadron on a raid to Berlin on the last night of August 1943. His aircraft was savaged near the target by a combination of flak and a night fighter attack. The kind of dual assault that became almost routine over the German capital during that period. Rather than bailing out immediately, Henley kept the badly damaged bomber airborne for nearly 500 kilometers, fighting to give his crew every possible mile toward friendly territory before the fuel finally ran out and he ordered them to jump. 4 of the 7 survived to become prisoners of war. 3 did not, including Henley himself, whose parachute failed to open in time. The wreckage came down at a small village called Ahrbrück, and it was German records from that crash, decades later, that allowed researchers to finally match a name and a face to the crew and give the family, still waiting for answers years afterward, something close to a complete account of what had actually happened to their son that night. That is what recorded actually means in this story, and it is worth being honest about it, because the reality is stranger and more human than any invented drama could be. German night fighter crews did not sit down after combat and write essays about the particular bravery of New Zealanders as a nation. What they left behind in claim reports, crash investigations, and captured airmen's interrogation files was something colder and, in its own way, more valuable. A precise, dispassionate record of exactly how these crews died, fought, and in some cases survived, seen from the one vantage point history rarely gets to hear from: the hunter's side of the encounter. If this kind of forensic, ground truth history is the sort of thing you want more of, subscribe now, because the next part of this story is where those two sets of records collide in the most direct way possible. In the account of one specific night when a New Zealand crew fought back against exactly this kind of attack. And one of them ended up on the wing of a moving bomber in mid-air because of it. His name was James Allen Ward, a sergeant pilot with 75 Squadron, and his story does not come from a German record at all. It comes from what happened after a Luftwaffe night fighter had already done its job. In July of 1941, Ward's Wellington was attacked during a raid, and the night fighter's fire tore into the starboard engine, setting it alight. In level, controlled prose, that sentence covers what was, in reality, one of the more extraordinary acts of the entire bombing war. With the engine burning and the fire threatening to spread into the wing fuel tanks, Ward climbed out of the aircraft's astrodome, into the open air, at altitude, in flight, and crawled along the outside of the fuselage and out onto the wing itself, kicking holes in the fabric skin for hand and footholds as he went, to reach the fire and smother it using nothing but a canvas engine cover, holding on with one hand while the freezing slipstream tried to tear him off the aircraft entirely. He succeeded. The fire went out. He crawled back inside, and the aircraft, against every reasonable expectation, made it home. Ward was awarded the Victoria Cross for it, the highest award for gallantry the Commonwealth could give, and he remains, to this day, one of the most improbable survival stories to come directly out of a German night fighter's successful attack. The German pilot who set that engine on fire never knew what happened next. He would have logged a hit, possibly even claimed a probable kill given the fire he almost certainly saw, and moved on into the dark to find his next target. The rest of the story, the wing, the fire, the medal, exists entirely because a New Zealand sergeant refused to accept that his aircraft was already lost. It is one of the clearest illustrations available of the gap between what a night fighter pilot actually recorded and what actually happened afterward in the aircraft he thought he had killed. That gap runs through almost every account like this, and it points toward the deeper, stranger truth sitting underneath this whole subject. The German night fighter force, for all its sophistication, radar, upward-firing cannon, decorated aces with over 100 confirmed kills between the best of them, was fighting an enemy it could only ever half see. It could track a shape on a radar screen, close the distance in silence, fire without warning, and log a result. What it could almost never do was witness the fight that happened afterward, inside the aircraft, among the men who survived the first attack, and had to decide, in seconds, in the dark, at altitude, whether to keep flying, keep fighting, or get out. The record the Luftwaffe kept, however precise, was only ever half the story. The other half exists in New Zealand Squadron histories, in escape and evasion reports, in the memories of men who made it home, and the letters written to the families of those who did not. And there is one more layer to this worth sitting with before we close, because it changes the emotional weight of everything that came before it. By 1944, as the RAF began flying Mosquito intruder aircraft directly into German night fighter airfields, hunting the hunters in their own airspace during takeoff and landing. The balance of fear that had defined this fight for years began, slowly, to shift. Men like Schnaufer and the other great aces of the Nachtjagd force found themselves increasingly vulnerable at exactly the moments they had once considered safest, climbing out after a sortie or coming home low on fuel with their guard down. The hunters, in other words, eventually became targets too. It does not undo what happened to the New Zealand crews lost in 1943 and early 1944, before that balance shifted. But it closes the story with a kind of grim symmetry that neither side, in the moment, could have predicted. By the war's end, New Zealand had paid a price for its part in the bombing campaign that is almost impossible to hold in your head all at once, relative to the size of the country sending these men. Thousands served in bomber command squadrons scattered across England, and a significant proportion of them never came home, killed not in one dramatic battle, but in a slow, nightly accumulation of individual encounters exactly like the ones described here, each one logged on the German side, in a claim report with a time, a location, and an aircraft type, and on the New Zealand side, eventually in a telegram to a farmhouse or a city street that the family who received it would remember for the rest of their lives. That is the actual answer to the question this story opened with. What did Luftwaffe night fighter pilots record about New Zealand bomber crews? Mostly, they recorded exactly what they recorded about every other Allied crew they hunted in the dark. A radar contact, a closing attack, a confirmed or probable kill, filed without sentiment because sentiment had no place in that cockpit at that altitude on that night. The nationality only entered the record afterward, on the ground, in the wreckage, in an interrogation room at Oberrussel, or, decades later, in the patient cross-referencing of archivists on two sides of the world, trying to give a name back to a number in a logbook. But somewhere underneath that cold administrative record sits something else entirely, something no claim report ever captured. The fact that on the other end of every one of those attacks was a crew of 7 young men, several of them very possibly from a small, remote country in the South Pacific, that most of the pilots hunting them had never given a second thought to, doing everything they possibly could, climbing onto burning wings, nursing crippled aircraft 500 kilometers toward home, to make sure that whatever got logged that night was not the last thing that ever happened to them. If this is the kind of history you want more of, quiet, sourced, told from both sides of the fight at once, this channel is built for exactly that. So subscribe before you go, because there are a great many more nights like this, one still waiting to be told.